Well, good evening. My name is Father Jason Mitchell. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Erie, so, up in the Arctic. I'm a good friend of Father Jay Donahue. We were seminarians together, and he said something about getting the parish in shape for Lent, and then somebody as well, too, as they're walking in, David said to me, "Are you going to get us in shape?" So I have a tall task in front of me. The gospel is very, very rich today. One of the things I do in Erie, I'm a professor at Gannon University, and I teach philosophy and theology, and every year it just gets worse because it's more about what not to say than what to say. So I told the deacon, if I go too long, cut me off. I don't know if he can turn off my microphone. We'll see what happens. But the gospel is very, very rich, and we read it every year, the first Sunday of Lent, the temptations of Christ. And I want to ask three questions that throughout we'll answer. Why is Jesus being tested in the desert? That's our first question. The second one, what is the meaning of these 40 days that Jesus is tested or tempted in the desert? And then lastly, why these three temptations? Well, first of all, anytime we hear anything about the desert in the Bible, it makes us think of Israel when they were in the desert, after they were freed from Egypt and they wandered the desert for 40 years. They didn't go straight to the promised land, but they were punished. And they wandered that desert for 40 years, and they were tempted to sin very often. In fact, when you read the book of Numbers, it's kind of depressing because they're just complaining. They're tempting God. They're rebelling against God. And so it's definitely a time of testing and purification. So what Jesus is doing is, he is the new Israel. Where Israel failed, he's going to conquer. We see that Jesus is called Son of God, even by the devil. Well, guess what? Israel was called the firstborn son of God. They're sons in different ways. Israel is an adopted son of God, while Jesus is the Son of God, the natural Son of God. There's also an interesting parallel. Right before the temptations, Jesus goes to the River Jordan, and he emerges from the waters, and he's driven out into the desert. Well, guess what? Israel, they passed through the waters of the Red Sea, and they went into the desert. Jesus, we're told, was led by the Holy Spirit into the desert to be tempted. Well, the people of Israel, they were led by a pillar of fire, a pillar of cloud. They were led by the Spirit through the desert. And Jesus, with his 40 days in the desert, recalls the 40 years of Israel in the desert. And then lastly, there's an interesting parallel between the temptations that Israel faced and the temptations that Jesus faced. You all are pretty familiar, I'm sure, with the story. When Israel's in the desert, they're hungry, and they call out for food. And God sends them bread from heaven, and he sends them quail. I probably would have complained. I mean, bread and quail for 40 years, come on. But they complained. They were hungry. As well, too, they tempted God. They tested God in a sense. And so the devil, the second temptation, he's like, test things out. Throw yourself off this temple and see if God will save you. And then the third temptation, the devil says to Jesus, worship me. Well, the people in the desert, when Moses was up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights and received the 10 commandments, they fell into idolatry. They worshiped the golden calf. And so what Jesus is doing is he's recapitulating that experience of Israel in the desert. But like I said, where Israel fails, Jesus succeeds. He is the true Son of God. He is faithful to God. He remains loyal to the Father. The second question we said is, well, why 40 days? Well, that number 40 is all over the Old Testament. The waters, they rained down for 40 days and 40 nights when Noah was in the ark. And so it was a period of testing. I mean, imagine being in the ark. And, day 20 goes by and you're like, okay, that's a lot of rain. Day 30 goes by and day 40 goes by. Would you be faithful? Would you still believe? As well, too, Moses was on the Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. He was purified so that he could receive the 10 commandments. And the reason why Israel was in the desert for 40 years, well, because the 12 spies that they sent into Canaan, they were there for 40 days, scoping out everything. And only 2 of the 12 said, we can conquer, Caleb and Joshua. But the other 10, they're like, no, let's go back to Egypt. We can't conquer these people. So the big question, are we going to we're going to trust in God? Or are we going to say, no, I can't do it? And so they were punished for every day that they were there, spying the land of Canaan. Not trusting in God, they were punished with a year in the desert. Elijah as well. He traveled for 40 days and 40 nights to go to Mount Sinai. And so what Jesus is doing, he's reenacting all of the 40s from the Old Testament. There's even another parallel. 40 is the number of a generation. So King David reigned for 40 years. King Solomon reigned for 40 years. And there were 3 things that Solomon was not supposed to do as king. He wasn't supposed to amass wealth for himself. He wasn't to have multiple wives. And he wasn't to amass an army. Well, King Solomon did all of those. In fact, he exacted 666 talents of gold. He fell into the temptation of possessions. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Fell into the temptation of disordered pleasure. And then thousands upon thousands of war horses and chariots. Was he trusting in God? Or was he trusting in himself, in power and pride? And so those 3 temptations, they're actually there present with Jesus. We read in the first reading that when Eve looks at the tree, she sees 3 things. That it's good for food, possessions. That it's a delight to the eyes, pleasure. And it's desired to make one wise. Desired to be prideful, to be powerful. And that's the root of all sin. We're always attracted to possessions, to pleasure, and to pride. And so today, the devil says that to Jesus. Do you want possessions? Make some bread. Do you want people to think well of you? Throw yourself down. Do you want all the kingdoms of the world? I'll offer them to you. Just bow down and worship me. So what we face every single day, the root of our sin, the temptation to possessions, to pleasure, and to pride, we have all 3 of those. And guess what? Lent is all about uprooting that. There are 3 things that we're encouraged to do during Lent. And I know we oftentimes reduce it to fasting. When I was a kid, I gave up chocolate milk. And I love the fact that Sundays don't count. If you ever calculate the 40 days, and so on Sunday, from the very beginning to the end, I was drinking chocolate milk. So we don't want to reduce Lent to just giving up something like food. But yes, it does help us, the fasting, the abstinence, it helps us curb that desire for pleasure. But we're also encouraged to give alms. And so if we struggle with that disordered desire for possessions, well, give alms. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. And then lastly, we're encouraged to pray. So fasting, almsgiving, and prayer. Prayer helps avoid that temptation of pride. When you pray to God, you recognize that I can't do it alone, that I need you. It's an act of humility. And so rather than fall into the temptation of disordered pleasure, let's exercise self-control. Rather than fall into the disordered desire for possessions, let us be generous and love our neighbor. And instead of falling into the temptation of pride, let us practice humility and pray to God and love him above all things. And throughout these 40 days of Lent, we're not doing this alone. We're accompanying Jesus in the desert. He was tempted and he conquered. And so we're going to walk with Jesus. We're going to contemplate Jesus. And in fact, if he dwells within us, then he will give us the power to overcome. And so yes, Adam and Eve, they failed. The people of Israel, they failed. King Solomon, he failed. But Jesus conquered, and he gives us as well power to overcome sin and live life to the full. Just making sure.